Warning: Geeking Toyetic is a show aimed at the adult collector, and as such features adult language and humor that is not appropriate for younger audiences. Viewer discretion advised.
Welcome everybody to another special edition of Geeking Toyetic. I'm your host Larry Roberts, and as always I am here to talk about all things collecting toys, especially for the adult collector. On this show we cover everything from vintage old toys from our childhood to modern toys that are just now hitting the shelves. Basically I just love to cover all things toys that I'm into and that I hope maybe you'd be interested in. And speaking of you, it wasn't all that long ago that I asked a bunch of you in the Geeking Squad group on Facebook what your favorite childhood toys were. Specifically, I was looking at toys from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Although in some cases there were some toys that went on to be around in the 1990s and even today. And while I'm so grateful that so many of you responded to this enthusiastically, I wound up with so many answers that I had to put it all together and narrow it down to just 10. So the list may not exactly be just 10, but you'll see how it worked out. Inevitably, some stuff still just got left off there that I hated to leave off, but fair is fair, so here are, as voted by you, your top 10 favorite childhood toys. Coming in at number 10, Marx Playsets. Marx Toys was founded in the early 20th century by Louis Marx. By the early 1950s, Marx was pretty much the biggest toy company around. And you'd be pretty hard pressed to ask any baby boomer about Marx Toys and not have them tell you that they loved playing with cowboys and Indians, or soldiers, or castles, or fortresses, all that stuff. That was all Marx Toys, and it was a huge hit back then. Now, Marx carried on for several years, but ultimately by the 1970s, it started to peter out. And unfortunately today, there's not a lot of people that really even know Marx Toys, at least not any of the newer generation of kids. I personally have really fond memories of the Fort Apache playset or the Navarone Mountain. Man, my friends and I had a great time playing with those things for hours. But like I said, unfortunately, those toys kind of have gone out of fashion, but they still remain really popular and really heartfelt to those of us who grew up with Marx Toys. So for that reason, it makes it into number 10. Number 9. Well, folks, we're already at a tie. There's going to be a few of those in this list, so I'm just warning you. But number 9 is a tie between Mattel's Rainbow Brite and Hasbro's My Little Pony. And it's no surprise to me that these made the list because these are two of the most beloved childhood toy lines from the 80s. Rainbow Brite and My Little Pony were not only staples every Christmas time that could be found under every little girl's Christmas tree, but they also produced popular comics, cartoons, coloring books, and all sorts of other paraphernalia that they could, basically anything they could put the likeness of these characters on to sell, and they did sell. Now, Rainbow Brite and the Ponies have both pretty much endured over the years. Their popularity has come and gone, but they've continued to be brought back, and almost every time they've been pretty successful. Often coming and going in popularity, but each time gaining new generations of fans. My Little Pony has reinvented itself numerous times. Hell, we even have bronies now, but that is a conversation for another time. Anyhow, with all of their colorful features and designs, the uniqueness of all the characters, and all of the imaginary play scenarios that it presents, it's no wonder that these toys made it into this top 10 list. Moving on to number 8, yes folks, it is yet another tie. We got a bunch of those coming. It is none other than Lego toys and FisherPrice toys. Now, FisherPrice toys may seem vague, but specifically the votes that were coming in were for FisherPrice Little People and Adventure People. And with both of these lines, it's no surprise this is on the list either, because not only do we have many fond memories of those when we were kids, but these are toy lines that continue to be extremely successful today. Now, Lego's another company that's seen its share of ups and downs over the years, but it always manages to come back strong, and it continues to have a really, really hardcore following, especially with new generations discovering it because of their various licensed properties, like Lego doing Star Wars, Harry Potter, and all sorts of other properties. These have been really popular with the kids of today, and it's managed to put a hurtin' not only on parents' wallets, because they're pretty expensive, but a hurtin' on their feet every time they step on one of those damn blocks. Those things hurt. And as for FisherPrice, that too has remained not only a staple in the hearts and minds of all of us that grew up with those toys, but all these new generations that continue to be inspired by these toys. Especially since most of us come across FisherPrice toys when we're like preschoolers or kindergartners. Those toys had such an impression on us at a very important part of our lives. And for me personally, both the charming little people as well as the awesomely fun adventure people had a massive influence on me when I was a kid. Whether it was racing cars around the parking garage, or playing with that silly little pink dragon in the castle, or racing your dragster around the backyard, or throwing up a guy in a parachute, or even playing with the TV action van. Hey look, you can make fun all you want. I had the action van. I thought it was a lot of fun. These were the kind of toys that not only inspired you, but educated you, and in many cases, I'm sure helped kids figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. So I think it's only fitting that two very inspirational and important toys for us when we're very little kids wound up being a tie together at number 8, Lego and FisherPrice. Number 7, migo action figures. While I'm not at all surprised that migo made it onto the top 10 list, I'm kind of surprised that it didn't rank a little higher with you. Migo Toy Company was founded by David Abrams and then passed on to his son Marty in the early 1970s, and that's when things really kicked into high gear. Marty allowed the company to move on from making cheap dime store rack toys and making it one of the most exciting toy companies of the 1970s, primarily by investing in licenses that were really popular at the time and making toys for them. World's Greatest Superheroes, Star Trek, Planet of the Apes, Mad Monsters, the list goes on and on. All of the coolest toy lines, especially from the early and mid 1970s, in my opinion, came from migo. In addition to making action figures based on famous TV and movie lines of its day, it also made all sorts of other stuff like board games. Look up the game Ball Buster. If you have never seen the Ball Buster commercial, you're missing out. Do yourself a favor and just look it up now. I'll wait.
Then try to bust your opponent's balls. You're a ball buster.
So in addition to making all these crazy board games and these cool action figures, they also made vehicles, they made electronic games, some of the earliest electronic games. And migo was pretty much the top of the heap until the late 70s when a certain sci-fi toy property came along from Kenner Toys and shook things up a little bit, and by the 1980s, migo was no more. And while over the years there have been a number of other companies that have tried to do migo-like toys and action figures, trying to cash in on the nostalgia of it all, finally, Marty Abrams himself came back and resurrected migo toys. Not only putting out action figures that are nostalgic and kind of styled after the old ones, but also putting out cool new designs and new characters too, making it fresh and relevant for today. It's a pretty big thrill getting to go into a store now and see migo toys on the shelves again. Anyway, I'm perfectly happy with migo being on this list because obviously it's one of my favorites. I could talk all day long about this, but if you want to talk to me about it, leave me comments, or if you want to know more about migo, go to migomuseum.com, where you can watch and read everything you would ever want to know about migo toys. They've got a great forum there where you can get all sorts of info, and definitely check it out. And coming in at number 6, yes folks, it's another tie. We're back to the ties again. and it is a tie between electronic handheld games and Hasbro's Transformers. Now, seeing Transformers on this list is certainly no surprise at all. Transformers continues to be one of the most popular toy franchises of all time. Now, while the Transformers came out in the early 1980s, it wasn't a completely new concept. A lot of the designs and style of it were based on previous toy lines. Some of them had been kind of popular, like Micronauts and Shogun Warriors. And seriously, as a huge Micronauts and Shogun Warriors fan, how did those toys not make the top 10 list? Seriously, what's wrong with y'all? But anyway, Transformers ended up being far more long-lasting and far more popular than either of those lines proved to be. Takara Tomy and Hasbro really took it to the next level when it came to awesomely designed transforming robot toys. These robots in disguise that could turn into everything from a truck to a car to a dinosaur to a giant pistol to a radio boombox. Just about anything it could transform into, they made one. Now, these came out when I was at an age where I was just about to get out of toys because I was too old for it, but luckily I was able to catch the early first wave of these, and these are really impressive toys. They continue on now. They've come out with numerous lines over the years, big blockbuster movies, Beast Wars, cartoons, comic books. Transformers is as big, if not bigger, than ever. Now, as for the other toy line that came in at number 6, electronic handheld games was all the rage, especially in the late 70s and early 80s. It was rare that you would find a kid that didn't own Mattel's electronic football or digital derby or Simon or Merlin. We got into so much trouble at school because inevitably we'd always get busted having these silly games in our hands when we were supposed to be doing our schoolwork. Although something tells me after the teacher took those games away from us and we went out to recess or we went to lunch or something, I have a feeling the teachers were probably playing those games behind our backs because, let's face it, those games were really cool and a lot of fun. Anyhow, the popularity of these games, along with the whole futuristic concept behind the Transformers, definitely signaled a change in the times where, before you knew it, everything was going to be focused around digital, handheld, computers. Everything was going to be about technology. And this was some of the first early seeds of that. So yeah, it's no surprise that these toys loom large in the minds and memories of a bunch of you. Number 5. All right, folks, not only do we have a tie, we have a ridiculous 3-way tie. Hey, I can't help it. This is the way you people voted on it, and these 3 all got the same amount of votes. So it's a 3-way tie between classic board games, Strawberry Shortcake, and the Care Bears. So I don't know about you, but I'm not surprised at all to see that classic board games got mentioned. I mean, they really should. Classic board games have been a staple of childhood fun for decades and decades, if not, beyond centuries even. And some staple classic games got mentioned like Clue, Dark Tower, Mystery Mansion, Scrabble, and of course Monopoly. Many of these games, and plenty of other classics like them, continue to be played and cherished in homes all over the world. And when it comes to Strawberry Shortcake and the Care Bears, honestly, these things just seem to get even more popular as the years go by. Both of these lines were released in the early 1980s, and as popular as they were at the time, they've continued to be resurrected numerous times over the years to varying degrees of success, but definitely gaining new fans every time. And both Strawberry Shortcake and the Care Bears have gone on to inspire generations upon generations of young kids. And judging by many of the responses and comments that I saw from a bunch of you, I think there are a lot of you parents out there that really get excited when you see your kids' faces light up when you hand them that Strawberry Shortcake or that Cheer Bear or Love-A-Lots Bear, and you see the same kind of love and adulation from them that you had for those toys back when you were a kid. Not to mention that both of those franchises wound up being extremely influential, and there were quite a few other toy lines that came out not long after that that tried to capitalize on the same kind of adventures and themes, and again, to varying degrees of success. But as it stands, it seems like very few of them can hold a candle to what Strawberry Shortcake and the Care Bears meant to all of you. I mean, who doesn't love brightly colored toys that smell really good too? All right, folks, well, from here on out, there are no more ties. Everybody secured their own spot. And coming in at number 4, it is none other than Mattel's Barbie. Well, this is certainly no shock, as Barbie is definitely like the grand behemoth of all things fashion dolls. Barbie is and was the trendsetter of all time, and pretty much paved the way for all other toy lines that followed that tried to copy its design. Barbie was a revolutionary concept at the time and inspired not only toys that were aimed at young girls, but a lot of toy lines that were aimed at young boys as well. The concept of buying a doll or a handful of dolls and being able to carry on that toy line with adding on accessories and clothes and vehicles and dream houses and pools and all these things was a new concept, and it was brilliant in that it allowed the toy line to just never get tired and old. There was always something new that could be added on. And this helped keep Barbie fresh and interesting, as well as allowing the line to remain always profitable. Before long, Barbie invaded every corner of pop culture. She's been in movies, cartoons, books, coloring books, you name it. Barbie is everywhere. It's one of the most popular franchises of all time, especially when it comes to fashion dolls and toys that are aimed towards young women. And even today, it continues to be a monumental success, and it's one of those few toy lines that can be equally shared and loved by everybody from great-grandmothers on down to their great-grandkids. And the adult collector community for Barbies is massive. Collecting Barbies is still highly regarded, and I think it's likely to stay that way for a long time. All right, folks, it's time for the top 3. And who came in at number 3? None other than Masters of the Universe. Well, as for me personally, I definitely think that He-Man and the Masters of the Universe deserves to be up in the top 3. Now, this was a quirky concept from the folks at Mattel Toys. Back in the early 80s, they were looking for something that could compete not only with all the fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons style adventure toys and cartoons and things that were out at the time, but also competing with the behemoth that was Star Wars and all the other sci-fi outer space adventure themed toys and cartoons and comics that were around at the time. So the good folks at Mattel came up with this really cool concept of taking the brawniness and the battles and the fantasy element of Conan and Dungeons and Dragons, but adding more of that sci-fi outer space laser sword and laser gun element and putting it into a pot and coming up with He-Man. Not only did it take a lot of imagination and ingenuity to come up with this, but it took a lot of guts too, because at a time when most toy lines were succeeding by being based on already existing properties on television or in comic books or in movies, Masters of the Universe was completely created from scratch. And while the cartoon and the comic books wound up being wildly successful, they didn't come until a little while after the toys came out. And I'm happy to say that when the toys were released, even without all of that television support, they were pretty popular. I remember being really intrigued and impressed with the look of these figures, the design of them. I thought they were really cool because they weren't as small and tiny and frail looking like a Micronauts or even a G.I. Joe or a Star Wars figure, but they weren't as big and cumbersome like an old G.I. Joe or a Big Jim figure or something like that. It was the perfect in-between. So Masters of the Universe was a direct hit with kids, which was even further bolstered by the popularity of its offshoot, She-Ra, which brought in a lot of the young female audience, and they had a massive hit on their hands. Unfortunately, the line didn't really last beyond the 1980s, and they had a couple of ill-fated attempts at reboots, and then that awful movie. I know some of you like that movie. That movie's terrible, I'm sorry. Those things didn't seem to really help in bringing back the original He-Man. But in recent years, at least the last decade, He-Man has seen a massive resurgence in popularity, as well as a resurgence in availability on toy shelves. Whether it's the RetroPlay Origins line, or the Classics line, or the Super 7 stuff, He-Man has gotten so popular, and I dare say it's as popular, if not more popular, than it even was back in the 1980s. There have been new cartoons and new comics that have been received very well. There have been rumors of new movies possibly coming out, and people still love the awesome old Filmation cartoon from the 80s. So I'll tell you what, when Prince Adam yelled out, "I have the power!" that guy was not joking around at all, because man, this line is still as popular or more popular than ever. And people just love He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and that's why it's number 3. And we're down to the last 2. Who's gonna come in second place? Well, it is none other than Hasbro's G.I. Joe. Now with this, I'm combining both the vintage G.I. Joes from 64 through 1976, as well as the Real American Hero that came out in 1982. This one came real close to taking the number 1 spot, but I think being number 2 is still pretty respectable because G.I. Joe got a lot of votes. And it's no surprise that G.I. Joe made it up towards the top of the list, because it is one of the most iconic, influential, and highly beloved toy lines of all time. Starting in 1964 as a 12-inch tall toy, it was one of the first to be dubbed an action figure rather than a doll in order to appeal more to the boys' sensibilities. But make no mistake, G.I. Joe took the general concept behind Mattel's Barbie and just applied it to this action figure. Kids could buy one G.I. Joe or maybe multiple, but then continue on expanding over the years by buying new vehicles, new playsets, new weapons, foot lockers, uniforms, all this stuff they added on, and it made G.I. Joe one of the most successful toy lines of the 1960s and the early 70s. Now, unfortunately, G.I. Joe didn't last well into the 1970s. They had a short-lived line called Super Joe in 1977 that I thought was really awesome, but it didn't do very well. And it wasn't until Hasbro resurrected the line in 1982 and scaled down the figures to be about 3 3/4 inches, redubbing it G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, it became a massive success right off the bat, expanding with all sorts of new characters, new designs, new enemies to battle. Kids just loved it and ate it up, thanks in part to the awesome Marvel comic that came out from the mastermind Larry Hama, as well as the really kick-ass cartoon that followed shortly thereafter.
Pork chop sandwiches! Oh shit!
Now luckily, I was just at the right age that I was able to take part in the first few years of G.I. Joe fandom in the 80s, and oh my god, those toys are great. So much playability to them, so much that you could expand and imagine with those toys. You could take them anywhere. It was a lot of fun, and clearly a lot of you agree with me because this ranked really high with a lot of you, mentioning things like the headquarters, the Sky Striker, the U.S.S. flag. I mean, I think it's still one of the biggest toys of all time. Basically, G.I. Joe had just about every feature and design that a kid could hope for. And it continues to be a massive success today. G.I. Joe is still on the toy shelves in various forms, and while it's had its own peaks and valleys in popularity, it's always done really well. And again, it's another line that I think is as popular now as it ever was. And in terms of the vintage collector aftermarket, oh man, G.I. Joe is one of the most coveted toy lines out there, with many of the carded figures and vehicles going for big numbers on the aftermarket. So whether you're a fan or not, you cannot deny the massive success, influence, and importance that G.I. Joe had upon toy collecting and pop culture in general. All right, folks, we've counted down all the way to number 1, and I think it's going to be no surprise to anybody out there that number 1 is Star Wars. I mean, yeah, did this shock anybody? It's freaking Star Wars. Not really arguably one of the most monumentally important and impactful things to ever be unleashed upon pop culture, and definitely one of the biggest phenomenons to ever happen. Star Wars as a film was an instant success upon its release in 1977, and people were already clamoring for the toys by the time they came out several months later. Before people ever even saw what these toys looked like, these things were destined to sell out, and sell out they did. During its heyday from 1977 through 1985, the Star Wars toys by Kenner were top of the heap. People loved these toys, and people like myself bought a lot of them. But even with that, even with all of those millions upon millions of toys out there, there is still a massive market for vintage Star Wars toys that causes these to be highly desired and go for a pretty high price oftentimes on the aftermarket. Star Wars suffered a slight lull there in the late 1980s and early 90s, but basically ever since then, it's just gone up and up and up. And with the release of prequels and sequels and expanded universe stories and comic books and cartoons like Rebels and Clone Wars and all that stuff, it's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And people like myself just continue to get sucked back in. Every time I say, I'm going to take it easy on Star Wars collecting and focus a little bit more on some of the other things, I just get drawn right back into it. I don't know what it is, but Star Wars, I mean, it's Star Wars. It's such an amazing universe, and the toys are incredible. And while not every toy they've released since 1978 has been particularly one of my favorites, it's always managed to draw me in and keep me interested, because overall the characters and the designs and the sculpts and everything are just so good and so well done that I love it. As you can see, I've got Star Wars toys all around me. I just love Star Wars, and clearly so do a bunch of you, because this easily made it into the #1 slot, and I ain't gonna argue that. And many of you specifically mentioned things like the Millennium Falcon, the Death Star playset. I have one of those behind me. You mentioned things like the Imperial Shuttle. You mentioned certain figures. There was a lot of Star Wars toys mentioned, and clearly you guys have a lot of near and dear favorites from your childhood. And yeah, that's why it's #1. So anyhow, yeah, that's it. That was the official top 10. Those were the ones that got the most votes. There were some that got a handful of votes but just couldn't make it in there. I'll mention them real quick. Things like Evel Knievel. A few of you guys, me included, love Evel Knievel. They just recently re-released Evel Knievel, and people are freaking out about it because it's so cool. $6 Million Man, that's another one I was really surprised didn't make it into the top 10, because that was one of my all-time favorites. Some more honorable mentions for things like Matchbox and Hot Wheel toys. I mean, a lot of us loved the Hot Wheel cars. Those were so much fun. Crisscross Crash, loved it. Some more of the late 80s and 90s properties got a few mentions, like Ghostbusters and X-Men. A few of you even mentioned some of those silly, ugly little dolls like Hug-a-Bunch and Cabbage Patch Kids and stuff. Cabbage Patch Kids were really popular for its time. I'm kind of surprised it didn't get more votes, but we'll see. Maybe if I do another one of these polls in the future, it'll be interesting to see if any of the results change. You know, it could happen. Some people even mentioned old toys like Weebles and Silly Putty and Pogo Sticks. Stay away from the Pogo Sticks. No good comes from Pogo Sticks. You know you're just going to wind up with a broken ankle or something. No Pogo Sticks, all right? Let's not bring that back. But anyway, folks, I hope you had a good time. I hope you enjoyed this list. And let me know, what do you think of the list? Do you think it's all bad and wrong? Did you have ones that you felt should have absolutely been in this list and weren't included? Do you think there were ones that were in the list but should have ranked higher? Let me know in the comments. I'm definitely going to do a follow-up on this, and I'd like to know what you think about it. As always, please leave your comments and your likes and subscribe, hit the bell, all that stuff, so you can be notified when I have new videos coming out. And I will be back soon. I've got a lot more content ready to go, so make sure you check back. But I think it's time to pull out my Maskatron and my $6 Million Man and have a little battle and relive old times. So on that note, bye.